May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So if God were on Facebook and needed to check mark one of the boxes under in a relationship with humans, I'm pretty sure God would check mark it's complicated. It didn't really start out that way, though. The first story we have of the relationship between God and humans is in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. And God put human beings into the Garden of Eden, a place of light and life and beauty and happiness and plenteousness and wonder and joy. And then it didn't take us very long to sort of mess it up and get pitched out of the Garden of Eden, out of paradise. And ever since then, I think God's been checkmarking it's complicated in the relationship with human beings. But I think one of the reasons why we had that first story set in a garden is because growing things, planting things, is something that almost every human being can connect with on some level. I know some of you will say, I have a totally black thumb, I kill absolutely everything. But most of us can keep a houseplant alive for a while or nurse our poinsettia along at Christmas time. I know some of you have beautiful gardens that you spend lots and lots of time in, caring for and nurturing, places that you are very proud of, and that are places of beauty, places where there's birds and hummingbirds and bees, and a place of solace for you. But almost every human being can connect somehow to the themes of growth and nurture and watering. Because Jesus uses those themes over and over and over in his parables and in his stories. Just think about some of the few that have to do with planting and growth. We have the story about the seed. Some of the seed gets scattered on rocky ground. Some of the seed gets scattered on the path. Some of the seed is planted in fertile ground and grows to produce 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. John loves the imagery of I am the vine and you are the branches. And he speaks about that imagery of our life in God and the way we are nurtured and nourished by God. But he also uses the imagery of pruning and how sometimes there are parts of ourselves that need to be removed, so the possibility of greater growth is present. We have the parable of the wheat and the weeds, with the good and the bad growing up together, and you can't discern which is which. And it's not until the harvest time that they are separated and the wheat is saved and the weeds are burned. And this is not the only story about a fig tree in the Gospels. There's another story about a fig tree. If you'll remember, Jesus is traveling with his companions and he's hungry. And he sees a fig tree, goes over looking for figs, and there are none. And in a very un-Jesus-like proclamation, he causes the tree to wither and die. And you're kind of like, well, what did the tree do to you, Jesus? But so then we have our lesson this morning about a fig tree. And in the parable we hear this morning, usually the vineyard owner is seen as God, who caused the tree to be planted in his vineyard. The gardener is Jesus. And some scholars believe that the fig tree actually represents all of the people of Israel. But the more common interpretation is that the fig tree is just the leaders of Israel. So when Jesus told this parable to his audience, and he said in the parable, the gardener says, oh, let me put manure on that fig tree. Jesus' audience would have been howling in laughter Because Jesus was basically saying, you need to put manure all around, cover the leaders in manure, and maybe that will make them somehow better. But I think what's really important about this parable of the fig tree is that Jesus says, let me have one more chance. Let me see if I can make this tree flourish. The people listening to the parable would have also known that in Jesus' time, if you planted a fig tree, it took it about 3 years before it was big enough to produce fruit. And for the first 3 years, that fruit was unclean and no one ate it. So if the tree has been unfruitful for 3 more years, that tree's been growing for 9 years. Most people would have given up after 9 years if you were expecting figs and still got none. But Jesus says, no, let me try one more time to see if I can get this tree to produce fruit. So we have all of these stories and parables and metaphors around growth and gardens and pruning and care. And it's a pretty common metaphor to use a garden for our own spiritual life, a place that we tend and care for. And in fact, the Society of St. John the Evangelist this Lent has been using that as their theme. I think some of you in EFM might have been working through their workbook about growing a rule of life. And there's been a lot of imagery in there about gardening and tending your garden. Because for all of us, I think that garden is a metaphor for our life in God. We tend it, we nurture it. Sometimes we do it better than other times. Sometimes there are parts of our garden that I think are absolutely beautiful and lovely, and the flowers are blooming and the trees are full of fruit, and we love to sit there and think about, look how beautiful my garden is. The problem with that is that it is often also true that at the same time there's this part of the garden over here that's kind of scraggly and brown and things are a little withered. But we're so happy sitting in the beautiful part, we ignore the part that is brown and withered. We don't really want to spend our time there. But I think that's where our relationship with God and its depth comes to make a difference. And in some ways, the reason Jesus told this parable. Because what does he say? He says, let me have one more shot at that fig tree. And even when there are places in our spiritual gardens that are withered and parched and need some attention, I think Jesus is always there saying to us, let me have another try at that. Let me see if I can bring some growth and some beauty and some life to that part of the garden. And I'm not sure it's really an accident, but if you think at the very end of Jesus' life, where does Jesus go just before he's arrested? He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, a place for him to pray, to plead, to spend time, to reflect and ready himself for the journey that he's about to take. So I invite you to play with this image of garden. Where is your garden beautiful right now? Where is it flourishing? Where do you like to sit under the shade of its trees and rest? But where are those places in your garden that maybe need a little bit more attention this Lent? Where are some places that need some water? Maybe some manure. Maybe a little extra sunshine. Maybe a little bit more time with Jesus to help you nurture that part of your garden. And as we walk our journey towards Lent, I invite you to sit in your garden. See where your spiritual life is. where can it gain some growth and some beauty? Amen.